What a day.
I missed that. That's all right.
He said
We weren't making...
You were making
We
fun
weren't
of me?
making fun of you, Paul.
Thanks a lot,
No,
David.
never.
Never make fun of the poor pianist. We'll just give him a plectrum and make him wear a neck brace harmonica. What else is there? Oh yeah, the wine glass.
It makes you stronger.
What
You're
about
right.
playing two pianos at the same time?
Oh yes.
Well, hey, don't you steal my thunder. We'll get to that. We'll get to that.
I guess we should start with the basics. You
Okay.
could just tell us a little bit about your name, country of origin, why you compose music, maybe, why you subject the world to the music of David M. Gordon, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. The answers to these questions keep me awake at night. Well, I am David M. Gordon. And I've already forgotten all your questions, but I am in fact a composer, and have been writing what at times resembles music for quite some time. Boy, it's been like 35 years I've been writing music.
Wow.
Impressive.
That's longer than I've been alive.
Yeah, me too. I write music because I feel as though I have to. It's a kind of compulsion. That's how I got into it. I just had the urge to write music. I heard music that I thought was really interesting, and I thought, hey, I want to create something like that, but better. I'm going to take those ideas, I'm going to tweak them, and then I'm going to call them my own. And so I did. And initially...
So,
Go ahead.
I want to hear what your first piece that you wrote was.
Oh, yeah. It was, well, do you want to know about my first completed piece or my first compositional attempt? Because those are distinct from each other. They are not
I
the
want to
same.
hear about your first attempt, because that comes out of your idea of like, oh, I heard this, I want to make something that's even better.
Yeah. My first attempt, if I am not mistaken, was a little thing for percussion ensemble that was notated with the help of my mother. Because I did not know how to fully notate my ideas yet. So some of them I was able to write down, but then others I would tell her, like, here's the sound I want. It's like, dun, 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 dun. And then she would figure out what that looked like and tell me how to write it down. That piece was never completed, thank heavens. But it was a nice start.
How old were you?
I was fairly young. I'm going to say, 12, 13, something like that.
That's awesome.
I haven't been doing music very long, I think. So wait, how old are you when you're in 5th grade? Wait, I should know this. Because my daughter is in 4th grade, and she is 9. It's 10. Yeah, it was probably 11 or 12. I think I'd only been playing for like a year. And just decided, that I wanted to do my own thing. And then I made some other compositional attempts over the next year or two. Some on just like notebook paper. When I was supposed to be paying attention to social studies, I would write music. And none of those projects were finished. I think the first finished composition was a drumline cadence for my junior high drumline.
Nice. Did it have any choreography involved?
Well, other than marching, no. Well,
You didn't do any interpretive dancing or anything like that?
No, but I'm sure that there were batons being twirled and like flags being tossed to it.
Yes.
Yeah, I was,
Yes.
but I was like further back in the band, so I didn't get to see the elaborate choreography. And it even got played at a junior high assembly, and I was told by the same kids who used to bully me that it was pretty cool because it sounded like Metallica.
Yes.
Yeah.
Win for David M. Gordon.
Yeah, and that was the peak of my compositional career. Right?
Your music, in my experience, often includes quite complicated and ornate and multi-layered rhythmic textures.
True.
Is that in any way related to your early interest in percussion?
Absolutely. 100%
Okay.
related. Yeah. I mean, I would say is one of the two primary reasons why I have such an interest in rhythm. Of course, as a percussionist, you're always dealing with rhythm, and as a percussionist, not only are you regularly performing complicated rhythms, but you're expected to play them with pretty much 100% accuracy. At least as I was taught, you never fudge rhythms as a percussionist. You do them exactly as the composer specified. So that certainly fueled my interest in rhythm. A lot of the things I was playing in high school and then certainly beyond had complex rhythms of various kinds. I think the other reason, though, I've had such an interest in rhythm is because I don't have a great ear for pitch. Meaning I can mentally visualize rhythmic patterns and interactions fairly well, but I have a much harder time audiating harmony and melody. Those I require like additional resources to hear. A keyboard or MIDI playback or something like that. Rhythm and timbre I can just hear in my head, at least
Okay.
better.
Very interesting.
That's really interesting. So when you write some crazy, bizarre thing for soprano, you're not actually hearing that. You're just like, I'm going to see how complicated I can make this. Let's see how high we can go and how low we can go in the least amount of time possible.
Yeah. I also often have my cats step through finger paints and then walk on the staff paper, and that helps me determine the direction the piece is going to go. No, for pitch relationships, I rely very heavily on MIDI playback or on my own awful slow motion renditions of the music on some instrument. But when I'm thinking about rhythm, I can usually get a pretty accurate mental image of it without those additional resources.
Very cool. So, important question to follow up with. I once gifted the composer David M. Gordon with a very small catapult. And I'm wondering if that catapult has in any way inspired any of your recent compositional work.
Well, I haven't worked it into a piece, but I found the cries of my students inspiring as they were struck by that little clay ball, which after a short period of time turned rock hard. Like, that thing could break a bone now.
I'm so glad to hear that it's been useful, David, and that it's, in that small sort of tangential way was really helpful with composition. That's good.
Very helpful, yeah.
Yeah.
Pain is always inspiring to me. A little bit prior to college, I entertained ridiculous notions of studying something other than music. I had a fleeting interest in chemistry, which lasted until I took a chemistry class. And then I realized that not only did I not have an interest, but I had no aptitude whatsoever. I developed an interest in the notion of being a psychiatrist. I don't know why, but that faded. So by the time I was applying for college, I was like, yeah, I should probably do music, since that's the only interest that stayed with me for a prolonged period. And it's the only one of these interests in which I have some actual aptitude. So I decided that I would double major in music composition and music education. Because like many who are transitioning into college, I thought, well, the only way to make the only way to make money as a musician is to be a teacher. But also, like many who start out with music education, I didn't initially realize that it was just K through 12. And I quickly realized I had no desire to work with children anywhere in that range. And so I quickly jettisoned the music education portion. I think my second year of college,
Okay.
I discarded that and just went with composition. By then it was explained to me that I was free to teach at the college level with just a composition degree. I need not have an education degree because it was a totally separate thing. And I was honest enough with myself to recognize that falling back on music education was not a good idea, because I didn't want to work in a K through 12 environment. So it just became composition. Once I finished my undergraduate degree at Northern Illinois University, home of the Huskies, I went straight into my master's degree at the same school. Actually, I was already taking graduate level courses during my senior year, so the two degrees kind of blurred together. Finished the master's, and then I went on to the University of Chicago, which was my top choice for graduate schools. I had this long list very hard to get into graduate schools that I was determined to apply to, and I did in fact apply, with U of C being my top choice, and that ended up being the only one I got into, was my top choice.
Wow.
Yeah. There were a couple of backup schools on there that I thought I could fall back on if I didn't get into any of the really big ones, and I didn't even get into those.
Oh my gosh.
They obviously didn't have the vision, to understand what you were doing. No, but really, I understand that.
That worked out.
That's good.
Well, yeah, I use this as a sort of teachable lesson for my students. You never know what's going to happen when you're applying for schools or for programs, especially in composition, because it's so subjective. I mean, I got into the top choice, which had probably the smallest likelihood of me actually being admitted, and didn't get into the ones that I thought would be much easier. And of course, the one that I got into was the last one I heard from. So I was tormented as I got rejection letter after rejection letter, including a fantastic one from Eastman saying, you have not been admitted to the program because the composition faculty was not impressed with your portfolio.
Oh, jeez.
It was the most tactless rejection letter I've ever seen.
Wow.
So I went off to the University of Chicago, where I studied with Shulamit Ran and Marta Ptaszynska, among others, and had a fantastic, if at times intense and painful experience. That took me nearly a decade to complete. PhD in composition. A lot of requirements, even though I already had a master's degree. And after that, I went out into the world to teach. And here I am.
And to
the
compose.
man I am today. I would do that occasionally on the side when I wasn't teaching. Paul doesn't know what he's in for with this next piece.
Oh boy.
So some of those side projects we're familiar with, and maybe that's a good segue for us. So we're really excited about an upcoming album release, November 13th. Music of David M. Gordon.
I've heard about this.
Yeah, we recently heard about it as well. The album is going to be called Mysteria Fidei, if I'm not mistaken. And love it if you would tell us a little bit about that. Well, I mean, not really us, because we know, but maybe tell our audience about it.
So I think you're talking about this album right here.
Yes!
Yes!
Yeah. Mysteria Fidei by composer David M. Gordon, which, if I'm not mistaken, is already available on Amazon for pre-order.
Yes!
That's exciting.
And can be purchased also from the Innova website. I mean, whatever this is, it looks fantastic.
It does look fantastic.
I do not remember the name of the person who did the artwork, but I do know the person who commandeered the artwork. No, these were drawn in these date back to the Renaissance. I added the color, the little bit of color. Anyway, I stumbled upon them, and they were disturbing, and yet slightly whimsical. Mostly not. Mostly just disturbing. And so I determined that I would make use of them.
So what is it about that? I mean, well, I guess we know what it is about that artwork, but could you tell us any more about why you specifically chose those few that you did?
Yes. Well, the one for the cover was chosen because, I'm still not sure what this creature is that's looking upward. But on this creature's back is what looks like the head of a devil. Mm-hmm. And that immediately spoke to me because it suggested a kind of spiritual conflict. Mm-hmm. I have no idea if that's what the artist had in mind. Mm-hmm. If I had to guess, I'd say no, but there is, as far as I know, no written commentary to go along with these illustrations.
Oh, wow.
So I interpret it as I saw fit, and that was kind of an intriguing notion to me. I'd already determined that I wanted to use some sort of woodcuts from the Middle Ages or from the Renaissance, because I love that style of art. So that had already made these of interest to me, but that particular one had that kind of spiritual component, at least in my view. The others were chosen, the ones from the interior of the album, for example, this one, which shows a kind of anthropomorphic fish cutting himself open, and there are other fish pouring out. And this, which I'm at a loss to explain, it's some sort of sinister-looking figure in a barrel with the water pouring out.
Yeah.
And then my personal favorite, which is also on my website, this one here, which is a creature that's like a hybrid of a violin and some other sort of thing. Mm-hmm. They were chosen, one, because I liked how they looked. They had a kind of element of mystery and suggested a kind of suffering, particularly the one where he was cutting himself open and more fish were coming out. Mm-hmm. They all were strangely distorted, sort of humanoid, but not completely. Mm-hmm. And of course, the one with the violin creature, I had to draw on because that had to do with music. Mm-hmm. But at this time when I was selecting these illustrations, I'd already come to realize that this album was in a lot of ways about suffering and perplexity and difficulty, and so these seem to sort of fit that subject. And I guess I should mention lastly, the one with the anthropomorphic fish cutting himself also seemed to suggest a kind of spiritual element, because I immediately thought of Jesus and all of the miracles that he performed involving fish. And here we have a kind of human-fish hybrid that's cutting itself open, and more fish are pouring out. I don't know what that means exactly, but they seem to have a kind of vaguely spiritual element to them that intrigued me.
So, the album has 3 main works on it, and I'm wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about each of them in terms of when you wrote it and what was behind the composition itself.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'll discuss them in the order on which they are heard on the album itself. So the first one is, I think, the most conventional work that I've ever composed, which is a short-ish art song called stilla, våra, andar. And it's set in Swedish using a text by Eric Hawkinson, who was a close friend of my great-grandfather, who himself used that text for a hymn that he composed that is still to be found in the Swedish Covenant hymnal. It's actually the only published work I know of by my great-grandfather, who was an active composer in the early 20th century, well, and I think in the late 19th century. Okay. He studied with Percy Grainger.
Really?
Oh my gosh.
And was a kind of musical disciple of Edvard Grieg.
Wow,
he didn't study with Grieg, but that was his musical idol. Because he was, at that time, and to some extent still is, one of the great heroes of Scandinavian music. And I think that's who my grandfather kind of aspired to imitate. Most of his music, sadly, has been lost. Anyway, this hymn is one of the last remaining works by my great-grandfather, and the only one that I know of that was actually published. And years before I ever composed this, when I discovered that hymn, I decided I at some point wanted to write a work that made use of that music. Just because that is the only evidence that I have that there's a composer in my family preceding me. I knew he was a composer, but I don't have much in the way of music. And if there were composers in the family before him, I know nothing about them. But here was hard evidence that one of my forebears was a composer. So I thought, I want to pay homage to him and this kind of legacy by using this. I didn't even know what it sounded like and kind of didn't care, because I thought, well, it's by my great-grandfather, I got to use it. Well, I didn't get around to actually making use of this until 2002. And what I think served as the impetus was that I was helping to organize a concert of classical music at my church. And I am not really a performer. I pretty much stopped practicing like my sophomore year of college. And so I even at this time, I was rarely performing. But I wanted to participate in this concert in some way. And so I thought, hey, I'll compose something for my wife to perform at this concert. I know her. She's a great singer. She attends the same church and would also like to participate in this event. And, hey, there's this hymn I've been meaning to do something with. And so it kind of all came together. Also, I was coming off of a very different sort of project. Those who know my music often don't realize that this Swedish art song was written right after I finished a piece called Friction Systems for 8th Blackbird, which is a nasty, violent, aggressive piece. So I think I was craving something different, something that had some beauty to it, something that would allow me to draw on my beliefs and my spiritual roots. So all this came together with this art song, and it's performed beautifully by my wife at that concert, and she performed it at a number of other concerts. And then I was on faculty with two lovely musicians, Paul and Kayleen Sanchez, and hit them up to perform on a faculty recital of mine. And I was like, look, I've got this lovely little art song. It's already composed. It's for a soprano and a piano. How about you perform it for free? You'll get nothing in return. And they did, and the performance was spectacular. And they have since, they being you, have since gone on to perform this piece a number of times. And I think this has become my most performed work. I think in no small part because of you two. It had a number of performances before you two picked it up, but besides Friction Systems, this I think is probably my most often performed work.
Wow!
And also the most conventional. But
we love the piece.
Yeah,
I think
every chance we get to, we try to program it. It's set so well, and the audience loves it. And when is there a time that people don't need to be reminded of peace in their lives?
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
I think we've performed it every year since that first performance, at least once a year. So it's definitely a favorite of ours. And in fact, I love the piece so much that I made a piano transcription of it for solo piano. Which was really, really wonderful because I love the piece so much that way I could actually play it without having to have, singer involved, which makes things more complicated. Just kidding, but
we all know this to be true.
Of course. No, I mean, of course, it doesn't sound as beautiful as when Kayleen sings it or with another soprano. But
yeah, you better say that.
No, at least it's all right. It's a solo piano version, so.
I guess all I'd add is that I've been very pleased with this piece. I can't say that for all of my music. There are a number of pieces I've composed that I would just as soon never hear again. This is one that I continue to enjoy hearing. I don't know if I had misgivings about taking such a conservative approach when I wrote it, but if I did, I don't remember them, and I remember my teacher, Marta Tashinska, being very supportive while I was working on this, even though this piece is it was in C minor, I think. It's been so long since I looked at the score. I think it's entirely in C minor. Like, there aren't any pitches outside of that 7-note Aeolian mode there. But yeah, this is, for whatever reason, one of those pieces that I still very much enjoy coming back to. A lot of the other pieces I composed around that time, I don't want to hear again. But this one, maybe because it had such importance, and I should point out was written in memory of my grandfather, the same grandfather who gave away all the music of my great-grandfather. He was a wonderful man who, I didn't get to know quite as well as I guess I would have liked to, but still fairly close with him. And for a few years before he passed away, he lived with my family. He and my grandmother actually moved in with us for a time.
Oh, wow.
Until she then needed to be hospitalized, and then he eventually started suffering from poor health, I think in no small part because she had passed away. And so I dedicated the piece to him, and so it still holds that importance too, and it still feels like a fitting tribute to a wonderful and important person. Even though he wasn't a musician, he was still just a fantastic person that continues to inspire me in various ways to this day. And of course, your performances of the piece are fantastic. I mean, they're always stunning. So I mean that in all seriousness, they are.
Thank you, David.
I mean, even Valerie likes them, and she is notoriously brutal when it comes to critiquing performances by other singers. And this one has potential to be really bad because she's sung this one many times.
I was gonna say,
And when she heard it, when she
beautifully.
heard you perform it, she went. There you go. There's your perfect performance.
Oh, that's really nice.
I guess I should point out the piece is not like an arrangement of the hymn. It uses elements of the hymn. And if you've heard the hymn, which barely anyone has, you can hear fragments of the hymn all over the piece, but it is not a straight arrangement. Basically, I just took segments of it and then composed around them and kind of reassembled them in various ways. So I don't call it an arrangement. I think of it as a brand new piece that is based on that particular hymn. But like the melodies, for example, even though they draw on the hymn, end up being very different from what you get in the hymn. And the harmony has almost nothing to do with the hymn. Of course, the text is still pretty much as it is in the original, except it's in Swedish. The original is in English. I decided to kind of retrofit it into Swedish because the only other remaining vocal music we have by my great-grandfather is all in Swedish.
Okay.
Wow.
And I also don't particularly like setting in English because I'm too close to that language. It just feels mundane and kind of clumsy just because that's the language I speak every day. To me, it feels like the Hamburger of Languages just because it's what I hear day in and day out. So I want to. I mean, I love hamburgers. Don't get me wrong, but in this case, I wanted something.
The Hamburger of Languages.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
So would you tell us a little bit about Consolation New?
Yeah, that one is the most recent of all the pieces on the recording. And that one was composed specifically for this recording project. We had already decided that we wanted to record Father Stilla and Mysteria Incarnationis, but that didn't seem like enough material to fill up an album. And I thought that the shift from the Swedish art song to the other work, which is large and stylistically quite different, would be too jarring. So I thought I should probably compose something that could bridge the two. I thought, hey, how about a solo piano piece? I almost never compose for solo piano. And I thought, here, I've got this great pianist available to do my bidding. I can manipulate him in whatever way I want. He's a simple-minded fellow. He'll do whatever I tell him. I'm just kidding, Paul. I am just kidding. I did want to try to highlight you because the other two pieces, even though they have a lot of keyboard, have the voice at the forefront most of the time. I mean, that's the nature of art song, right? And so I thought, well, look, I've got two great musicians here. How about I give Paul a chance to break loose on a solo piece? So that's what led to the composition of Consolation New. It's funny. The pieces that surround Consolation New both draw on some sort of pre-existing material. I don't recall basing Consolation New on pre-existing material for that reason, but it ended up working out nicely because then all three pieces were based on pre-existing sacred material. The third piece, Mysteria, doesn't make use of any pre-existing music, but it makes use of poetry from many hundreds of years ago. So this served as a nice connection between all three of the pieces. Well, first of all, I wanted to write a piano piece that was not like other solo piano pieces. At first, I entertained the notion of...
I think you succeeded.
Well, thank you. At first, I entertained the notion of just writing, like, a straight-up piano piece. And, frankly, I couldn't do it. I just could not get inspired. I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One, of course, is something I mentioned earlier, which is that I tend to think very heavily in terms of texture, color, and rhythm. And of course, what is piano? In what area does piano reign supreme? Well, it's not so much those two; it's harmony. When people are composing for piano, they're very often putting harmony at the forefront. And I think initially I thought that'll be a nice challenge, but what I instead found was that I just couldn't get inspired. Something about that time in my life, I just wasn't feeling a kind of conventional piano piece. But I think the other thing, probably the more important issue, was that there's so much piano literature, so much great piano literature already. As I told some other people at the time, I didn't feel like I needed to add anything to that literature. Like, it was like throwing a cup of water into the ocean. You'll never find that water again. There's so much great stuff out there. I thought, well, Paul, I'm sure whatever I write is going to give a great performance, but if he ever stops performing the piece, who else is going to pick it up? They've got literally thousands upon thousands of pieces to choose from.
True. That's true.
Many of which are like bona fide masterpieces. I hesitate to use that word. I'm not a big fan of it, but I mean there are some spectacular music in the piano repertoire. Much of it underperformed, and so why do I want to even add to that problem further? So I said I'm going to do something unlike any piano pieces that I know, so I ended up writing a piece for a pianist playing two different pianos at the same time, a grand piano and an upright piano. And the upright piano is tuned microtonally. The grand piano is tuned normally. And this really freed me up and got me inspired in a big way. Now I could think in terms of alternate tuning. I had a kind of ready-made way of working in symbolism into the piece, because you have these two instruments tuned differently. How would I treat those? Are they going to conflict with each other? Or are they somehow work together, fuse into one? There seemed like a number of possibilities. So that really got me going, and soon after, I determined that I wanted to base this on a shape note hymn. I had used a shape note hymn as the basis for a movement of my dissertation piece, a piece called Quasi Sinfonia, which is a chamber symphony that I wrote for Contempo. The third movement is a set of variations on an old shape note hymn. And something about that repertoire has fascinated me for a long time. I don't know how familiar you are with it or how familiar,
Not very familiar.
people who are watching this video are with it, but it's sacred music from the 19th century, mostly the American South, although a good amount was written further north. But these are called shape note hymns because they were used not just as congregational songs, but they were also used as pedagogical tools so people could learn how to read music. And the different scale steps were notated with different shaped note heads. So the scores have this kind of wild look, like some of the notes have triangle note heads, some have rectangles, some have circles, etc. That could then help people learn the sounds and characteristic tendencies of the different scale degrees. That in itself is kind of interesting, but what drew me to these is that they sound like they could have been written in the Middle Ages. Stylistically, they are totally out of step with pretty much every other kind of music in Europe and North America that was being composed at that time. I mean, they're filled with all these open fifths and spare octaves. Yeah, they sound very ancient and austere. They don't sound like something that was written in the American South in the 19th century. They sound like a slightly newer version of medieval organum.
Okay.
Which has fascinated me to no end.
Yeah.
And it's a tradition of sacred congregational music, specifically associated with Protestantism, but that most Protestants know nothing about nowadays. Also, there are groups that continue to perform this music to this day, and they perform it with a very peculiar intonation. It's not performed in equal temperament.
Oh.
The vocal technique is totally different from the sort of vocal technique you find in Western art music. It's more like shouting, actually, and there's no vibrato. It's very flat.
Okay.
And, suffice it to say, you kind of have to see it and hear it to believe it. It's very distinctive and very exotic, considering its origins. And it just absolutely fascinates me. And so I decided that I would use one of those. They're also all modal. So I picked a shape note hymn called Consolation New. By the way, for those who are watching this, or you two as well, that repertoire is not normally called shape note hymnody. More often you hear it called sacred harp.
Okay.
Yeah. So if anybody's trying to find more information, you'd have more luck looking up sacred harp singing.
Okay.
Yeah. So the entire piece is based on one of these hymns called Consolation New. And like the Swedish art song I was talking about previously, it's not really an arrangement. It's more like a reimagining. It uses materials from the hymn, but not in a linear way. This one, interestingly, though, even though the setting is much more radical than what I did with my great-grandfather's hymn, it's, I think, actually easier to follow the manipulations of the material because the melody from the hymn, if you've heard it, is almost always there. It's almost a theme in variations, except in this case, it doesn't follow the conventional presentation of the theme and then set of progressively more complex variations. It just dives right in with variations on this. You don't get anything like a straight rendition of it until the very end.
Yeah.
That's how the piece ends. And that's a maneuver, by the way, that was inspired by a piece by Charles Ives. I think it's called The Revival. It's from one of his violin sonatas. Anyway, he's got a movement called The Revival, and it's a reverse theme and variations based on, is it Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing? I think it is that one. Anyway, he does something similar there. He starts with variations that are very distant from the actual hymn, and it becomes progressively clearer as you go until you finally hear something like the original at the end. And you're like, oh, I've been hearing that all along. That kind of intrigued me. So I took a somewhat similar approach, although the two pieces sound nothing like each other.
Just from my perspective, performing it, I remember the first time I saw it and trying to imagine the sound. I remember looking at the instructions and trying to imagine the quarter tonal sounds, and the best I could do actually was to get my Yamaha keyboard and detune the whole thing by a quarter tone, which I could then play next to my acoustic piano, and that actually gave me a pretty decent idea of what to expect, and actually helped a lot, because then when I got to the actual situation with the tuned pianos, it wasn't completely shocking.
Yeah.
And I think actually knowing what to listen for and knowing what actually was correct when it sounded different than what would be expected was helpful, because it's quite shocking. And actually, David, the one thing that I still chuckle about is learning some of the really technical passages, because I did it with the tuning as much as I could in place, and it's sort of dizzying, the whole experience, because it's something in your brain just twists. At least for me, it was always sort of jarring, like a phase effect.
He
almost.
Succeeded.
Yeah, David's grinning because of it. But on the other hand, poor Kayleen would sit there listening to me rehearse this for hours on end with this tuning, and you hear one pitch next to the next, constantly going back and forth, and it was pretty funny.
Yeah, it's a distinctive piece. It's funny. At the time, I imagined that this piece would be about conflict, some sort of inner conflict, but that was just a vague idea in my mind. I don't know how I arrived at, except maybe to say that I had decided I wanted to use two pianos tuned differently, and that suggested the idea of a conflict between tuning systems and instruments. Eventually, I arrived at this idea of a kind of conflict. And I guess the text of the hymn also suggested that, because it talks about suffering and the desire for release from it. But it didn't have any more personal resonance than that. I just thought, this will be a piece about conflict, because the text is about conflict. And I finished the piece, and very soon after, I entered into a really nightmarish period of my life. And that's when the piece started to resonate with me, and I realized that it had this kind of strangely prophetic element. I don't mean that to sound weird or anything, but the piece became much more potent for me as a listener, because of what I experienced just following that. The kind of conflict I was writing about became a reality. And so in that way, it's come to kind of hold a special place for me. But it's a very dark, and I think in some ways unpleasant piece, and was designed to be that way. I don't want it to be an uncomfortable listening experience, but I do want people to be taken outside of their usual sort of sphere of comfort and familiarity, and kind of inhabit this space where all is not well. And I feel like I've achieved that goal. I need more feedback from more listeners and performers, but the feedback I have gotten suggests that I have achieved that goal.
I think so.
I think so.
It's certainly intense to watch too. And that was something I was conscious of as I was writing. I thought, well, this is going to be a piece that not only sounds very different, but that looks very different. It is going to introduce listeners to a sort of pianistic virtuosity that they probably haven't encountered before.
No kidding.
There are other pieces in the repertoire for pianists playing two pianos, but they're few and far between. You rarely hear them. So to most audience members, this I think is going to seem novel. So the last piece, which is the bulk of the album, is this very large song cycle called Mysteria Incarnationis, which means Mystery of the Incarnation. Mysteries, I should say, plural, of the Incarnation. And it is a setting of various fragments from poetry by Ephraim the Syrian, who is a 4th century poet and theologian, possibly a composer. Some scholars of his work have speculated that he may very well have composed music to go along with his sacred texts, that they were meant to be sung, and that he may have actually composed melodies. If that was the case, they're long gone. All we have now are the words. But his poetry is voluminous and very vivid in its imagery.
Yeah.
It's a little hard to describe. It's as you might imagine, it's almost entirely sacred, if not exclusively sacred. And is filled with rich imagery using paradoxes and symbolism of various kind, biblical allusions everywhere, but in sometimes rather unfamiliar ways. And it's all written in Syriac, which is a language that most people don't know anything about. I didn't know much about it prior to writing this piece, but the way I found this stuff was by doing a search for early Christian poetry. And when I mean early Christian poetry, I mean like within the first few centuries of Christianity's existence.
Yeah.
I wanted some very ancient material. I am a huge fan of Hildegard von Bingen's poetry, but it's been set quite a bit. Her poetry is very well known. I wanted something kind of off the beaten path, and I quickly stumbled upon Ephraim's poetry. And found some English translations and was really wowed by the poetry itself, but I was also intrigued by the fact that it was set in Syriac. Most of the time when you think of early Christian poetry, if you think of anything at all, you think of stuff in Latin.
Yeah.
Right? Well, here's a language very different from Latin. But it's poetry that in some ways resembles Hildegard's, with all these amazing sort of poetic vistas. So I jumped right on it. And at the time I was teaching at an institution that had at least one Syriac scholar on faculty. So I got together with him and we talked about how I could get transliterations of the text.
Yeah.
He helped me track down somebody who was able to transliterate. He helped me with some of the text. It was kind of a team effort.
Yeah.
But I had composed vocal music in unusual languages previously, so I already knew how to use the International Phonetic Alphabet. I knew how to work with phonetic transcriptions and transliterations. So this was kind of a continuation of what I'd done before. It just was amped up quite a bit. It was a lot more text. The language was a lot less familiar.
Yeah.
All that just meant it took more time and thought. But I really enjoyed it because I've always had an interest in languages and linguistics, and so I really enjoyed getting familiar with that language. The language itself, I should point out, is it's kind of halfway between Hebrew and Arabic. It's no longer spoken, but there's a lot of important literature, particularly sacred literature in that language, and so you continue to find people studying it, reading in it, speaking it to this day.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's still alive, but there are no people anymore who have that as their native tongue. Yeah. So getting back to where I started, I found these texts and excerpted portions having to do with the Incarnation. Just because I found a number of great texts on that subject, and thought I could make a cycle out of them. I hadn't initially set out to do something about the Incarnation necessarily. I just wanted a cycle of ancient sacred texts that was unified thematically somehow.
Yeah.
And I found a number of great texts by him about the Incarnation. He has a whole collection of poems called Hymns on the Nativity. And there were so many wonderful passages. I thought, well, this has to be on the Incarnation. There's so much great material.
Yeah.
So I narrowed it down to the texts I wanted, got them transliterated, and then went to work. Initially, this was supposed to be a piece for just voice and piano. You two got on board very early. Before I even started this thing, I had asked if you would be willing to perform a large song cycle, and you were like, "Sure, why not?" And as I got just a little ways in, I realized I wanted a third instrument. What I was hearing was another sustaining instrument. So I settled on the violin. And so that ended up being the instrumentation, voice, piano, and violin. At this point, I don't think we were on faculty together anymore. I think you had moved on to Baylor. You must have,
Right.
because I asked you if you knew a violinist there.
Right.
Yeah.
And you said no. So I asked some people that I knew, and this person talked to this person who talked to this person, and eventually the name Eka Gogachashvili came up.
Yep.
I was told that she was a wonderful violinist and happened to teach at Baylor. And so Paul approached her, and she was interested, and the rest was history there. And she ended up being like the perfect violinist for this. My goodness. Like, she interpreted this exactly like I wanted it to be interpreted, which is not at all how most violinists would interpret music of any kind. There's no vibrato. She's got a wood mute on most of the time. Like it doesn't sound like normal violin music, but she really brought out the character I was hoping for. So kudos to her. This is a big piece. It's about 40 minutes long, and is in 6 movements, each using a different passage or group of passages, but they're all on the subject of the Incarnation. And each of them is kind of looking at this issue of Christ's incarnation and how paradoxical that seems from different angles, from different vantage points. I mean, some of them are are so-called lullabies. Like that's actually what Ephraim himself called them, because they're narrated by Mary, the mother of Jesus, as though she is speaking to or singing to her infant son.
Yeah.
Others are in the third person, but they're all looking at this complex subject from different vantage points, and that was really interesting to me. And I wanted the music to feel unified, but also be contrasting from song to song. But it's quite a journey. It's I think it's the longest piece I've composed. But it's also, even though it's 6 movements, it's one continuous piece. Like there are no gaps between these movements. So I think of it as one giant movement that has 6 parts.
Yeah.
And that was a new challenge for me. I mean, many composers, I suppose, have done that on multiple occasions and are more comfortable with that. But for me, it was a real challenge. Creating continuity over that span of time without just stopping and then starting something brand new. It's easy to write 40 minutes of music when you can, well, not easy maybe, but easier if you can then just be like, okay, done with that movement, let's drink some coffee and smoke a cigarette, and now let's just do something totally different. It doesn't necessarily have to continue on from what came before, but when it's one long piece with no gaps, like it needs to all make sense together. So it was a challenge, but an enjoyable one. It was being written while I was teaching quite a bit, and so there were long stretches where I wasn't able to work on this at all, and that made it even more challenging. I would just get into a rhythm, and then I would have 6 classes that I had to teach, and so I would have to put this down literally for 2 or 3 months, and then come back and somehow get back in the groove.
Yeah.
So it took much longer than it really should have. But it eventually got done over a span of years. It did get done. And this is another piece of mine that I'm very pleased with. In fact, this may be the piece that I'm most proud of. At least in certain respects, I'd say.
Yeah, you should be.
This was one, it's a rare thing for me when I hear a piece performed for the first time and it sounds not only like what I had hoped it would sound. Because, I mean, look, as a composer, you rarely know for sure what your music's going to sound like until it really gets going.
Yeah.
Right? As Christopher Rouse once said, a composer who I hold in high esteem, if you're totally clear on what your music is going to sound like before you ever hear it, you haven't taken enough risks. There should be some surprises in there, right? Well, some of my pieces end up being nothing but surprises, and not the pleasant kind, where I'm like, whoa, that is not what I wanted there. This one came out sounding pretty much like I wanted it to, but better. And that is a real rarity for me. I was elated when I first heard this, and it's just gotten better and better as you all have had a chance to live with it. So it's a piece that I've ended up, taking great pride in. And I'm delighted that it's finally been recorded, because this, I think more than just about any piece I've written, felt like it needed to be recorded. Like I needed to have a record of this. Some of my other ones I'm content to see just fade away into the ether. This one I was like, no, I don't want this one to go away. Like I want to remember this one.
Yeah.
What else can I say about it? I mean, I hope the music sort of speaks for itself. Composers say that all the time, but this one I really hope will speak for itself in that the music was designed to convey the mood of the poetry, and sometimes even the symbolism inherent in the poetry. Like there are musical symbols spread out throughout this work, but I wanted the music to sound ancient. I wanted it to sound sacred. I wanted it to sound mysterious, exotic. I often write music that is supposed to sound like indigenous music from a non-existent culture. This one sort of falls into that category. I didn't want this to sound like 4th century Syriac music. I don't know what that music would even sound like.
Yeah.
I did, however, want it to sound like ancient music that conceivably, at least in part, could have come from the region in which these poems were composed. There was no attempt made at authenticity, but I wanted it to draw listeners back to that era, and at least somewhat closer, maybe, to that culture, musically speaking. Certainly than they would be on a normal day. But, in the end, it's music of an imaginary culture. But I hope that it'll transport listeners somewhere else, to a time and a space very different from their current one.
I don't think you need fear that that's not happening at every performance. No, really, I think it's been a really deeply meaningful piece for both of us, and I think there hasn't been a single performance that we've gotten to do together where we didn't have audience members come up after the concert and want to express their feelings of being transported. I think that's exactly what it is going somewhere else. In your music, I often find this deep vision of something beyond the realm of what we can articulate, and I think that is why it just fascinates me. And so some of my I've told you this before, but some of my favorite moments of music of any composer are yours, and so Father Stilla, våra, andar is one of those pieces, and another one is Mysteria Incarnationis, and actually specifically in Mysteria Incarnationis, there's one moment that I hear in my head, whether it's bidden or not, it just sort of is there, and that's the lullaby, the first lullaby often starts kind of going. Mentioned that to you before because you mentioned taking other people's tricks and taking them as your own, and that thing has been going in my head so much that it manifested itself quite clearly in a new piece that I've been working on, and so I admitted that to you, and you were gracious enough to I think make a few mocking derogatory remarks and then give me your blessing. So I appreciated that. But anyway, for what it's worth, David, I don't think you need fear that you're not taking people somewhere very, very special and somewhere that we need to experience.
Yeah. Well, that's nice to hear. Yeah. I mean, behind all this, too, I think is a desire to compose sacred music that's, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Out of the ordinary. That has spiritual resonance, that causes people to think more seriously and more deeply about sacred texts, sacred symbols, and so forth, but that is not really like what they would normally imagine to be sacred music. It's something that I don't know a lot of composers presently trying to do or interested in doing. I mean, the main proponent, I think, of this sort of approach was Olivier Messiaen, whose music I find very compelling. But that was certainly something I was after, I think, with all of the works on this album. I should point out, though, too, that most of my music is not overtly sacred. So this isn't always a priority. That was one of the things that brought all these works together. The whole album is sacred music, sacred chamber music, and they're all based on pre-existing material. Subsequent albums that I release may have little to no sacred music on them. But when I do write sacred music, my hope is that it'll be intriguing and cause people to think in a different way about these issues and these texts.
Talking about me again?
Talking about you again.
Oh boy. So, if I'm not mistaken, there's an official release date set. Even though it's available for pre-order, the official release date is November 13th.
Yeah, correct. Friday the 13th.
Oh boy.
Was that your idea, David?
No, I had nothing to do with it. I really did not.
Any words that you might have for a listener who has never heard your music before and who would like to pick up a copy of Mysteria Fidei? Anything you'd like to say or that you would encourage them to have in mind before listening to the album?
Couple of things. I guess what I would say is that, one, it's helpful to read the liner notes if you can get your hands on them. I don't think this music requires an in-depth knowledge of the subject matter, but I think it really helps if you do. And the program notes for this album are fairly extensive, particularly for Mysteria Incarnationis. It really helps to have those texts in front of you, but also to be able to read about the subject matter and why I approached it the way I did, and the differences between the various songs in the cycle, why they're set in different ways. Why are you hearing a toy piano here, for example? What is this drone on the glass here symbolizing? So that's one thing I would say. Both the digital and the physical releases should have the notes available with them. I guess number two, I would say expect some of this to be intense. This is an album that's about suffering. It's about perplexity and struggle, not knowing what's to come, or if anything is to come, and searching for meaning and peace and release in the midst of all of that. That doesn't necessarily make for easy listening, but I think that amidst the pain, there's also a great amount of beauty. And so expect that, emotionally speaking, it's going to be a bit like a roller coaster ride. And some of it is going to be comforting, and some of it is going to be quite the opposite. The piece in the middle, Consolation in particular, has a lot of intensity to it. But that piece eventually reaches a point of repose. I mean, it symbolizes death, but it does reach a point of repose, and there's a release there, which I find very comforting. I don't know how others will view that. And I guess what I'd also say is be willing to listen for a stretch without interruption, because Mysteria Incarnationis is not meant to be excerpted. Of course, composers of art music invariably will say that same thing. Oh, you can't listen to it in segments. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. With this piece, I think it's definitely true. Like, this is one long musical journey. It's meant to be undertaken in one sitting. So if you've got the time and energy, I say go for it. Yeah, and one other little note, if it sounds like there's distortion on the second track, it's because those pianos sound so strangely together. Like, if you hear a kind of like, whoa, 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 and you're like, what is happening to my speakers? No, that is what those two different tunings sound like when they collide with each other.
My brain has not recovered yet from that experience of sitting right there between the two pianos.
Well, it's intense live, but that beating that's created between the two pianos is that much more intense on headphones. I didn't realize that till the other day when I had it up loud, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is like overwhelming." It's just, which in my mind is all all the better, but I don't know if everyone will agree on that. But it's intense. However you look at it. Yeah. And of course the performances are fantastic. You can't get a better group of performers, in all seriousness.
Thank you.
Perfect performers for all of these.
Thank you.
Like, I don't imagine anybody else is going to outdo these performances. So it's worth it just for that. Because these are not easy pieces. Not at all. Not at all. They're not easy at all. We didn't even mention that Kayleen is playing all sorts of percussion instruments while singing in a language that's been dead for like over 1,500 years.
There is that. And actually, for anybody who's watching this and would be interested in learning more about that, Kayleen and I did a video, a little bit of behind the scenes footage, and Kayleen talked a little bit about some of the challenges of singing the quarter tones and learning the Syriac and playing all the doubling instruments, and I spoke a little bit about some of the other things that are more in my purview, and that video will link in the video for this one.
Yeah.
I think it's called like our craziest project ever or something
like that.
that.
Yeah, it's a good video though. You can hear some of the music, see a bit of the scores. It's nice. So,
well,
thank you, David.
Oh, hey, it's been my pleasure, friends.
Thanks, David.
Sure.
It's good to see you. I wish we could see you in person, but
you probably got to run.
Kayleen has opera rehearsal now, so.
Yeah, I got to run too. Although, Paul, there were a couple of things I wanted to tell you about, but I can do those maybe as I'm walking out. But
okay.
Are we good though with this?
I think we're good.
Yeah.
Cool.